Okay, here we are. Part two, or rather, two-part, sorry, those words mean different things. Two-part finale for Enterprise. This was put out by Kodo and directed by LeVar Burton. This is actually LeVar Burton's final inclusion into Trek, unless you count Family Guy. And, I don't know. It kind of sucks to lose him. He's a good director, and he's got a good head on his shoulders and tends to do pretty decent stuff behind the camera. As with so many other TV stars in general, not just from Trek, they tend to have that drift from TV star to director / producer / working behind the camera, especially if their career goes on long enough, and certainly that seems to be applicable to Trek. But it's good to see that he still knows his stuff. Like I said, he's one of my favorites amongst the group of favorite Trek directors. Originally, there was going to be a different story. In fact, it was going to be a Season 4 story. This isn't a Season 5 thing. About the Optimum. Before I elaborate, how many of you know what I'm talking about? I'm actually curious. So the Optimum is an invention of the Reeves-Stevens crew over in the book Federation, my favorite Trek book that I keep referencing because the authors of it are some of the main showrunners for this season, so it just kind of keeps coming up. But the Optimum was an idea that was tied into the World War III thing. It wasn't the cause of World War III. It was just one of the many flames that was fanning what would become the nuclear barrage of World War III. Now, that Optimum, well, was run by Colonel Green. They put together an idea on cards. Now, this may sound unprofessional. This is actually pretty common. In fact, I've done presentations like this where you just have an idea. And so you just get a bunch of like index cards, like you used to take notes on at school. And you basically do a really rough storyboard. Here's this shot, then we're going to see this, then we're going to see this. And that's how you sell your pitch, right? Manny Kodo apparently loved this idea. But at the same time, that interview contradicts another interview. So what happened is either they didn't want to do this because they didn't want to have another augment story, since the Optimum was tied into the augments, as well as Colonel Green, or Braga just shot it down outright. Take your pick. It's worth noting these stories are not actually mutually exclusive, it's just they're told in such a way that they sound like they are. It's entirely possible that this is just exactly why Braga shot it down. I don't know. Either way, we didn't get that, so instead we get this. We start off with, we're setting off the human xenophobia stuff that we've been laying bricks for a while at this point, actually. Most of Season 4, at the very least starting with Home, as I pointed out back then. And, we also get Peter Weller. Now, Peter Weller's a good actor. He does some good stuff. He's a method actor, which... Well, there's some baggage with that phrase. I think that's the simplest way I could put that. And for good reason. But he does good work. And I do like him. And I liked him in RoboCop. Legitimately. Like, I actually like his portrayal in RoboCop. But it helps that that's actually a good film, not just schlock. But then we have the way he presents himself here. There's a sort of... The way I want to describe his performance is he comes across as someone who is seemingly calm, but actually isn't. Allow me to describe it this way. Let's say I don't actually have anything I can use to do this with, do I? I just have cables that I don't want to strain in such a way. Picture, if you will, for a moment, I have a string here, and I just have it laying here, and it's just kind of casually laying here. This is calm, right? Now, imagine for a moment I have the same string, but I have wrapped it around my fingers, okay? So I wrap it around my fingers a couple times, and then pull! And it's super taut here, just sitting here. Now, if I hold it very carefully, very steadily, to the point where I stop shaking, now you can see just a simple thread, and it looks calm. But it's not. It is pulled taut. The tension is there. And it's just noticeable enough, especially if you pay attention to the way it acts compared to an actually calm thread. That is Paxton right there. And that's the presentation that Mr. Weller gets across. It helps tremendously and helps to flavor his particular brand of villainy. We also see immediately that he is a villain. He actually gives a flat-out veiled threat to the person working for him, which, let's just be honest, that is 101 for, hey, I'm a bad guy. I'm not making fun of that, though. It's a good moment because it's a good thing to immediately establish he is the villain of this arc. And then we see a baby with Vulcan ears. Huh. Moving over to the Federation that doesn't exist yet, we have the idea of people want to put a face on who gets credit for these major historical events. Anyone who studied history knows that there's a disturbingly common tendency to have one individual get most of the credit for major operations, even in some cases where that person doesn't really deserve it. Gene Roddenberry. So, I'm sorry, I didn't actually mean for that to be a Roddenberry jab, but I realized in mid-sentence that is a perfect example of what I'm talking about. Roddenberry actually, by every account that I have studied and read, and I researched the hell out of Trek over the last 9 years, especially the TOS stuff, and the early TNG stuff, which is relevant for this topic, Roddenberry deliberately pursued a policy of historical revisionism, claiming credit for things that other people would do, and affixing himself as the face of the franchise. Now, what's interesting about that is whether that is malicious or not is something we can debate. Whether that was something that was done because of ego or villainy or anything like that is something we can debate. It is, however, a fact that he was doing it, that he was taking the credit of so many other names and so many other people and attributing them to himself. Now, the reason I say that that's a debatable thing with regards to villainy is because sometimes people don't want that credit. They don't want to be that face, and they don't want to be that front person. Sometimes, for the sake of branding, you need a charismatic face. I don't mean literally physically, although I guess I can mean that literally physically because human beings automatically respond to certain types of physical attractiveness better, just by automatic default. It's built into us. So, having a good face for something is important. I always use this example, and I will keep using it as long as it keeps being relevant. A good speedrunner is not necessarily someone who is a good presenter of a speed run. And thus you need that person who has that charisma, that knowledge, and that presence in order to be the presenter of the speedrun. Sometimes they're one and the same, sometimes they're not. It just varies, right? So when it comes to major historical events, or fictional things, or series, or books, or games, or whatever, it is valuable to have a face to affix to that. Even from just a branding perspective. This is a such and such thing. The only way it irritates me is when we take that to the next step, when we go past what I consider acceptability and put all of the credit on that person. Now, how is this relevant here? Well, there's this Samuels guy, who we've never heard of before, but is obviously a minister, and thus a reasonably placed politician within EarthGov. And he's the face for this movement to start these talks in order to begin the burgeoning alliance that will eventually become the Federation. Now, whether that's acceptable or not is debatable. I think the events of this episode show that he is not villainous in his desire to be this face figure, though. Quite the contrary, it seems that he is primarily motivated to make this work. And thus he is presuming this status as the face for that exact reason, for the branding purposes I mentioned earlier. Like I said, there is a value in having a noticeable visual, I am the person behind this, such and such movement, the picture they're going to put next to the newsreel kind of a thing, right? But you can see how it would be irritating, especially to the crew of the people who actually helped make this happen. In fact, Shran and Grawl should probably be here too, along with T'Pol and Soval and Archer and Tucker, and you get the idea. There should be more people involved in that because there were more people involved in that. Which leads into the other competing thing. The people who actually do want credit. This episode makes clear, and this is something that's shown up before, that Archer doesn't actually want the credit. He doesn't want schools named after him. He doesn't want planets named after him. He wants to be forgotten. Fortunately for him, history will forget him completely, and he will never be referenced again, so he gets his wish. But, you know what I mean. In all the stuff that was before this, but is also after this. I don't know if he's actually mentioned in New Trek. I have no idea. Anyways. You win, Archer! But that's not true for everyone. Some of them obviously do want to have some stake in that. And that makes sense because of personal pride in the events, of course. But even for reasons that would be considered less selfish. Like, for example, I want to make sure that history records the fact that it was actually the Enterprise crew, the crew of the Kumari, what's left of them, and Graal's people that actually got this thing started when we were fighting the Romulan incursion. that needs to be in the history books. It doesn't necessarily need to be the main topic, but we need that credit, right? Otherwise, history is being written, there's no nice way to put this, inaccurately. And this is a huge problem in real life. I cannot tell you how amazingly frustrating it is being a history geek. Because everything I have ever said about history has all had that asterisk next to it. That is this is what we think happened. And there's gradients, there's gradients of certainty depending on how many different sources agree. You kind of triangulate to the truth. But, anyways. So, we have the universal translators, which are now clip-ons. We're starting to advance forward. We're walking. Then we see Gannett and Mayweather and their awkwardness. That's cool. I'll come back to that in a minute, because the next thing I want to talk about is that an unauthorized woman with no badge and no nothing waltzes in to a major meeting with several diplomats and officials. Thankfully, she's an NPC with a quest hook and not an enemy. I know we always make fun of Starfleet security, but I figured, EarthGov security would have something going for it. So let's talk about the value of build-up and payoff. Because we find out, dun dun dun, the baby is Tucker and T'Pol's. Okay. So it's obviously like artificially gestated or something. Like, we know that immediately. Now, I want you to restructure season 4 a little bit. You know how T'Pol and Tucker kind of shifted back into the will they won't they throughout season 4? While I do like the scenes between the two and the development scenes between the two, the will they won't they thing was one of the biggest aggravations for me. Part of the reason for that is because I knew we were going. Imagine, if you will, that at the beginning of season 4, probably around home or immediately following home, maybe at the end of the Vulcan arc, they just are together. They codify it. They say, you know what, I'm here for you. I know your mother might not approve, but I love you. And she responds, and and he's like, it's okay. I know you can't admit it yet. I know you can't accept that yet. That's okay. And he just holds out his hand, and then she's laying there, just kind of distraught over the death of her mother, and she slowly puts her hand on his, right? And the two just are together for season 4. Okay? Restructure it that way. Now, that's way back at, that would have been episode 6 or so? 6 or 7. Pretty reasonably early on. Jump forward to episode 20-ish. I think this is actually episode 20, which I think where we're at right now. And now, bum, 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 there's a child. You see it? You see the value of this? Because now there's this question, and now there's this, and at least adds something. Now, I wouldn't make a big deal of it. In fact, quite the contrary. I, as a creator, would use this to establish just how strong their bond has become. Because I would have that moment of questioning for a narrative thematic reason, which I'll actually discuss next week. But I would still have him believe her firmly and thoroughly, and have her be uncertain because she's not sure if it happened or not, and someone just messed with her. But him being firmly on her side, no. You would never hide this from me. And I know you wouldn't. Just show that solidarity and show how far they've come. My opinion. Instead of this whatever. This then leads to the pro-human, anti-alien sentiment. Samuel, confirms this discussion. He actually mentions the need for alien alliances, especially in his own words, now that the Vulcans aren't watching our own backs. What's funny to me is Archer takes offense to that for a moment, probably because he tends to believe that, we got to stand on our own thing. But Samuel's absolutely right here. Really think about that for a second. I mean, you don't have to, because I've already discussed this at length. I have nothing new to add to this. Earth is the dinky new kid on the block. They need this position as the fulcrum of alliances between other races. Otherwise, they are screwed at an interstellar level. I mean, to use the national example, it wouldn't be hard to presume that one power or another, without this kind of web of alliances, without this political machination, that someone would move in and just annex, probably destroy, but let's assume annex for a moment Earth, and then Earth stops existing. Earth just becomes another part of the X-Empire. Maybe one kingdom or one province of it, but nevertheless a part of this other entity. and EarthGov ceases to exist, Starfleet ceases to exist, this is not hard to presume. And if they're nice about it, they might do it in a way that doesn't involve oppression. If they're not nice about it, then we have problems. Historical problems. So then Section 31 shows up. Hey, it's only been 4 episodes. Another reason I mentioned that, we must never talk again thing with Section 31 was irritating was because imagine for a moment, this is just a thought that sparked right off the top of my head as I was watching the scene. Imagine for a moment that there's an arc, probably going through a theoretical season 5, of Archer working through Reed, and Reed working through Section 31 to slowly kind of form Section 31. And you're probably thinking, what do you mean? They already exist. No, I mean actually forming them, shaping them, carving out the format that Section 31 would take in the future. The idea of an organization, as I have always posited, of people who are willing to do what is necessary, but don't want to. An organization of Cisco's, not Justice Lords, to put it bluntly. An organization of people who are legitimately committed to the ideals of the Federation and actually want to help. That they don't want to commit villainy, that they don't want to use their power or abuse it or become a corruptive force, and instead can overall be a decent force for good. And thus have this connection be a regular contact point and have their missions kind of help shape this over time. That could have been a season-long subplot. Hell, that could have been a multi-season subplot. Anyways, this then leads to an interesting little tidbit here. We see, I'm going to talk more about this next week, but there's an interesting contrast between Greaves and Paxton, because Paxton, despite being the top wire, is nevertheless the reasonable one. He's the one who, shows empathy and decency with regards to humans, at least. Greaves is the bad cop to Paxton's good cop. This is really common in fiction, to have the villainy be done by a duo, one of whom is more overtly villainous and one is more passively villainous. When done properly, this is awesome, because the passively villainous person is usually the actually terrifying one, whereas the more obvious person is more like a thug on a leash. Useful. That way they can avoid being seen to be horrible, like a certain lawyer I could mention from TNG's early days, but let's not get into that. Anyways, kind of wish we'd seen more of Jeanette. Jeanette? Oh god, what is her name? Gannett. Gannett was her name, I think. Travis's ex-girlfriend. This is another thing that would have been kind of cool, especially since we find out more about her in the next episode, but this is the kind of thing that would actually help to flesh out someone who desperately needed character time. Travis, as is evidenced by the fact that I just screwed up his name earlier. Travis has had so little to him. In fact, honestly, the last episode he had was Horizon. That was season 2. He, being, the space boomer, the person who lived all his life in space and is very much at the cutting edge and wanted to join Starfleet and wanted to push himself, while at the same time maintaining traditional values, could have been an interesting contrast to the woman who herself apparently doesn't really particularly care for space travel, mentioning the colonial thing that she had an interesting line about. But also with her and her ambitions driving her in a slightly different direction. And I just think there's some character dynamics there that could have worked. I've said this so many times. You want to make good fiction, especially long-term fiction, long-form fiction, like television. You establish connecting points between characters. The points between the characters arguably are more interesting than the characters themselves. Odo and Quark is probably my go-to example for this. But there are many, many examples of this just in Trek. A connecting point between her and him might have actually been interesting, but alas, end of series. So, this is when we see Colonel Green. This is funny, because I hadn't seen whatever that episode is of TOS for years and years and years and years, except I just watched it a few months ago when I was going through the TOS stuff, and that episode went live a few weeks ago, I believe, at this point. I'm not sure of the exact timeline. We should be in the TAS stuff at this point, so yeah, probably. Anyways, it's interesting because they actually went out of their way to do his hair and dye it and do the sideburns and just make him look like a similar version of the Colonel Green that was shown back in TOS. And, yeah, he's horrible. What I love best, this is assuredly on purpose, is Paxton is talking about him with Greaves. And at one point, Paxton says, blah, 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 blah. I wonder if history has misunderstood this man. And as soon as he finishes this sentence, we immediately cut to Mr. Green saying the next best thing to the 14 words. Yeah. Anywho, irony, the moon is the main base for Terra Prime. Yeah, no, that tracks. I mean, only an idiot would actually be... I'm sorry. So, this then leads to a couple little nice tidbits. I mentioned Samuel earlier. There's a bit of a red herring about him. We learned that you used to be part of Terra Prime. He's like, yeah, used to. And Archer tries to push him, and Samuel shuts him down hard. No. I've made peace with my demons. I've moved on. That was dumb, stupid child me. I was looking for a blame figure for an accident. Remember that. It's going to be important. Anywho, T'Pol and Tucker agree to infiltrate this place. This is incredibly stupid. It's actually the weakest part of the entire episode. Two incredibly public figures who are system-wide known, let alone known to the people who are actively enemies against them, considering the fact that they stole their DNA for this project, decide to infiltrate their main base. I didn't catch the exact second mark, because it depends on how you define it, but at the very outside, it took them less than 5 minutes to be caught. Good job! I mentioned the tribal layer thing. I don't remember which episode I brought it up on. Do you remember that? We went from racism and genderism, using race and gender to using economic status to using, good aliens versus bad aliens. I talked about that whole layer of tribalism thing. You notice we're seeing that again here. Paxton and Terra Prime consists of people from all walks of life, both economically as well as in terms of their race and their gender. They are humans. But all that's happened is the tribal line has been shifted up another layer, to the point where humans are okay. All humans are okay, but, you get those pointy ears and we don't like your kind around here. It's just interesting to comment on. I probably should have saved that whole speech for here rather than there, but it's just as relevant. I think I talked about that in home. Anyways. Regardless, Paxton decides to speechify. As usual, there is a degree of validity to the villainy argument, as most good arguments include at least a little bit of fact, for reasons I will discuss next week. Sorry I keep saying that, but, He mentions the Zindi. What reparations have the Zindi done for the death of the 7 million? I'm just curious. Obviously nothing at this point, at least theoretically. There's another question for you. Why has Enterprise been roaming around giving out access and information to Earth's home and just saying, hey, we're over here to every alien they meet? This is one of the first things they do in Season 1. No joke. Like if you track it, like if you get past Broken Bow, Broken Bow, and then move on to the next episode. It's like in the second or third episode, one of the first things they do is, hey, there's an alien. Here's Earth. So Gannett turns out to be spying. Oh my god. Dun, dun, dun. This also explains the glitch in the system earlier. A little bit of a small Chekhov's gun, but it's there. And then we find out, oh my god, they're going to do the incredibly dangerous thing of warping in system. I'll never stop making fun of that. It's so stupid. It is so stupid. There's no reason a warp field in system should be problematic, except for possibly gravimetric concerns. And even that would vary based on the specifics of the star in question. And even that's questionable, since that gravimetric field doesn't really affect things at a severe level unless you're really close to said star. And never mind the fact that, if you can't warp in system, then you're going to enjoy a long trip getting out of system before you warp anywhere. This is completely ignoring the many, many dozens of times ships have visually been shown to warp in and out, pretty much of, right being in orbit of a planet. I had to throw that in there, didn't you? It's okay. Now, this is probably going to be a bit of a short one, because we're going to wrap up much of Enterprise next week, and I have several things to talk about, which I've already made notes on here. But I felt like they were more relevant next time. I mean, there's a couple other tidbits. The Corridonites, that was actually cute, since the Tellarites opposing them, and their entry into the Federation is actually one of the plot points of Journey to Babel. That's cute. Harry Groner, I think I'm pronouncing that correctly, who plays Samuel here. That was kind of cute. But next time we will discuss more specifics about human nature, about arguments, about themes, and about an unfortunate thing with regards to a young, adorable baby. I hope you'll be there for me for what is actually the series finale. I'll see you there.